This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Going back to one of the founding fathers of systems trading, of trend following today, my guest, Bill Dreiss. Bill takes his experience back to the 1970s, maybe even earlier. Not unlike many rogue traders, so to speak, and Bill might not like that word, but I say rogue affectionately. But somebody outside the system doing his own thing, going about it his own way, choosing his life, frankly, a life of freedom. He did not go the direction of having the most assets under management, but he has endured for decades with an approach that's rock solid scientifically. This is one of those moments where you get a chance to dive into the mind of someone who's essentially a founding father in the industry. I hope you enjoy this conversation with systems trader Bill Dreiss. I want to jump in with one of your, I don't know if you would call them your heroes, but Benoit Mandelbrot. I want to stay at something very philosophical at the beginning. And he had a point in talking about the 2008 time period. And he's talking about the efficient market theory proponents. He said they like to take these 2008 events and sweep them under the rug like they're an act of God and forget about them. I'm sure you connect with that. Why don't you tell the audience where he's really going with that?
Actually, what he's saying is that from a statistical point of view, the markets are not random walks. There's a bias in the markets, there's a persistence in the markets that leads mathematically to what we call fat tails. This is an intrinsic characteristic of the market. It's not sort of an exception or something that's out of the ordinary. It's an intrinsic behavior of the market. What I did, I was working for Mandelbrot. I applied his idea of fractal dimension to the different markets and actually did an analysis of all the markets to see if they had essentially a fractal dimension that indicated that they were persistent. After going through all the markets and finding that to be true to varying extents, I had what I consider to be a scientific argument for Mandelbrot's conjecture. That's what he's saying. He's saying that the efficient market hype guys got it wrong when they were assuming that the markets were random. Part of the reason for that, in my opinion, was that these were top economists and people like that. They were unable to beat the market themselves, so they decided that nobody else could beat it either, and then came up with the idea that the markets were purely random. What's notable that Mandelbrot's first paper on fractals dealt with the cotton market. His first paper on fractal geometry dealt with the futures market in cotton. He started off in that direction. It was the exception. There was a book called The Random Nature of Stock Market Prices or Stock Prices that was popular back in the 50s or 60s. And he was the dissenting voice in relation to the random walk theory of the markets. Even now, it seems to be embedded in the academic view of the markets. It's long since been proven, not only by analysis, but just by experience, that that's not true. And I think pretty much the idea that the markets do in fact have fat tails, shall we say, is pretty much accepted, certainly among market participants. That's what provides the basis for trend following. It basically says that trends persist longer than would be expected if it were a random distribution. And so that extra extension is what provides the opportunity for trend following to work. It's true for everybody. The particular methodology I use is based upon fractal geometry, but the persistence in the markets is what makes any reasonable trend following system operational.
Let me keep it at the word academic for a moment. If someone looks at your background, they're going to be like, wow, Bill, MIT, Harvard, this is the start of what somebody would call as an academic pedigree. But you go to the more practical side. I mean, of course, we'll speak to it in a little while, but early on, operations research, defense contracting, whatnot. So you saw your side of that, but then you go to the speculative side, go out there and kill it entrepreneurial side. You're a pioneer. You've been doing this for a long time, and we're going to go back to your early career in a second. But what were you thinking while you're trading? You're making money. You're making a lot of money over many decades. All of these academic folks are getting all of this publicity. All of these wrong messages are going around. And I'm not going to say you or other trend followers were in entire anonymity, but it was pretty anonymous for a very long time. What were your internal thoughts when you would watch these academics going down this one path, and here you are actually living it and seeing something entirely different?
You talked about my academic pedigree, but I stepped out of that, shall we say, just in time. I went to work for a think tank in California when I got out of business school. We were doing pretty much state-of-the-art modeling in terms of force structure analysis and missile targeting and that sort of thing. This was at the height of the Cold War. A lot of that involved looking at things from first principles. That is, instead of taking existing tools, we actually re-derived or invented various techniques. That led us into a much more independent way of thinking about these things. What I found over the years is that there are a number of topics in which the scientific consensus is not supported. But this is sort of one of my early discoveries. So the point is, I think to some extent that the academics are overeducated. That is, they learn models, generally physics models, that they then try to apply to markets. And these models are not appropriate. Had they started at a more basic level in analyzing these things, they'd come out in the same place that I've come out and other traders.
The freedom that you had is what gave you the advantage, the freedom to go down the path and explore.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, I've lived my life to sort of maximize that freedom, the way I've arranged my life. I've had the opportunity to think about a lot of things, shall we say, independently of a structure that is in some ways fairly restrictive. The whole idea of publishing, and in other words, most academicians have a day job that keeps them from spending a lot of time doing creative thinking, shall we say. I think I've just had the freedom of not being in that institutionalized environment. And I think that's true. If you talk to other CTAs, I find there's a lot of similarity between them. I know of other CTAs who have been interested in physics and interested in various other topics that had nothing to do with CTAs and had original ideas on these topics that are not in the textbooks and that are not quackery, because these are educated, intelligent people. There's another world out there that exists more or less independent of academia.
Before you even got to the point that you had some of your early trend following systems, what would have been the first example that you read about or understood as someone else doing this trend following thing? Would that have been Donchian?
Yeah, I was introduced to Donchian by my boss at this think tank I was working in. He was a retired Air Force colonel, had come across Donchian. He sort of introduced me to Donchian and got me interested in it. I had access to Air Force computers. We had a little bit of advantage in terms of testing systems and trying them out. I read Edwards and McGee, all the Bible of technical analysis, and I found that somewhat helpful. And in fact, I found that most of the patterns that they used were not informative. Really, the only patterns that counted were things like trend lines and support and resistance. So I set out to design a system that automated that kind of technical trading. That was my first system. Later on, my second system, the one that started in 1991, was based upon a more sophisticated analysis of the data, that is, that came from Mandelbrot, but generally the same features that my original model had in terms of trend lines and support and resistance.
Can I keep you at that early stage, though? I'm curious. I bring up Donchian, you bring up Edwards and McGee, two very different thinkings. What did you do with Donchian when you first saw what he was doing and understood what he was doing? Did you go ahead, code it, reverse engineer it, and figure it all out for yourself?
Well, no, I think Donchian was pretty, as I recall,
Moving average.
yeah, I think moving average crossovers, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it was pretty basic stuff. In the early days, simple systems worked really well because nobody was using them. You're competing against discretionary traders who had all the impediments of that style of trading. Almost any system would beat what the average discretionary trader would do. And that changed a bit over time as more and more people got into business. But nevertheless, the business is pretty much the same as it was. That is, it's a matter of designing a system and then sticking with it.
Let me keep you also with some of those early stage personal philosophies. In preparing to talk with you today, I don't know if I saw you use the word necessarily, but I'm sure you have at various times. I started to think of isolation. Isolation in the sense that here you are, you're figuring out where you want to go. You've got a few pieces of information, a few data points of other people and other things. You weren't necessarily on a collaborative team. This was kind of like you and your thoughts. You weren't calling up Bill Dunn and John Henry and Ed Secoda. You were doing your own thing.
Yeah, that's right. I think they were doing their own thing too. We were all discovering the same phenomena, basically. Those people you mentioned, I know Ed Secoda and Marty Bergen, they basically made the same discovery, if that's the word, or I should say they confirmed the discovery of Donchian, that a system would generally be discretionary traders or most traders in terms of the market. This has all been talked about extensively recently with Daniel Kahneman in his Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talks about how systems, comparing clinicians against simple systems, the systems tend to do better, not because they're smarter, but just because they're more reliable. They aren't subject to a lot of biases, a lot of psychological biases and other kinds of biases that tend to work against the trading. In other words, we're really born with certain psychological biases, and they're very, very hard to overcome. And of course, as a systems trader, the hardest thing to do is to stick with your system because you're always looking at the markets and you're saying, oh, gee, maybe it's going somewhere else or whatever. The most important part that is understood by all of these traders that you mentioned and anybody who is successful at trend following is you basically got to stick with your system, regardless of what you think the markets are going to do.
But when you first saw Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, here you are, a trend following trader doing this for decades, back to the 70s, even the 60s. But when you see Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow for the first time, isn't there a side of you, not to take anything away from Daniel Kahneman, isn't there a side of you that says, well, gosh, me and some of my peers figured a little bit of this out a long time ago, before it was popular?
That's exactly right. Yeah, you read this in the sense, but by the same token, Daniel Kahneman was doing his work at about the same time that we were doing our work. And we were operating in different spheres, and maybe we didn't know about him, didn't know about us, but by the same token, it wasn't like we scooped Daniel Kahneman. It's just we were applying it, and we were applying his first application of an algorithm to clinical practice was back in the 70s. So it was just a matter of different people working on different fields that were discovering this.
Let me take you back to where I started this conversation with, because I would love for you to put your professorial hat on to the extent that you want. Let's imagine you've got a room full of doctors, attorneys, young MBAs, all kinds of people, and they don't know about you. They say, gosh, he did really well in 2008. Now, I saw that movie, The Big Short, and the one guy did really well in the movie, The Big Short, but this guy, Bill, he did something different. He was in all kinds of markets that were moving. Give a blow-by-blow as to why a year, and there could be many years and many events we could go through, but 2008 seems like a good one, why that year could unfold to where you could do so well. A lot of people will think if they hear your track record for that particular year, they'll think, oh, he did what the Big Short guy did, or he just shorted the S&P. They won't have this holistic thinking that it was all of these markets moving.
There was no decision involved in that process. That was the business I was in. I didn't change my trading at all. I might say that this was a banner year for all CTAs, or for, I should say, all trend followers. And the simple reason was the markets trended very strongly. Anybody who was a trend follower was going to capitalize on that. The difference between me and the guys in The Big Short is they actually dug into this stuff and figured out what was going on and had a specific plan to deal with it. Me, I was just lucky. It was just a market situation, which was very amenable to the way that I trade. But I didn't do anything different or didn't foresee anything. I didn't foresee the crash or anything. It just happened, and I was in the right place at the right time.
Well, your strategy from the ground up was built to take what the markets give you. You weren't trying to tell the markets to give you what you want at any particular time. You're saying, I'll take what you give me.
That's right. And that's, again, where persistence come in. The markets exhibit persistence, and that persistence is what allows me and other trend followers to make money.
I know, going back in time, a surfer, a fan of surfing. How long have you surfed?
I started surfing when I got out of college, actually. Just sort of got the bug. And I mean, one of the reasons I got into commodities was that it was something I could do from wherever I wanted, could live wherever I wanted to, and design my life around surfing and living in those places that had good surf. And of course, that was until the last few years. I've, shall we say, tapered off a bit just because of age. But for a long time, surfing really defined my life, defined where I lived and what I spent my time doing.
We're going to talk about a lot of things that are inspirational today, but that's a really inspirational point for people to think of in this day and age where so many people don't design their life. Maybe they talk about it. There's a lot of books about designing your life today, but it's really a cool story that you decided early on, man, I love surfing. Wow, this commodity trading, and okay, I can get a system, and then I can choose how I live. Putting that all together, people talk about this on social media and share all these ideas now, and Tim Ferriss has a book about what you just described, but you were doing it a long time before. Did you have anybody in your life that was giving you these freedom ideas to go live that way? Or did you just look at it and say, okay, this trading thing looks really cool. I really want to surf. Wow, let's connect the dots here. And this is what I'm going to do.
It sort of evolved. It wasn't necessarily something that came to me all at once. But what I remember is that I was working for a company and doing that. And I looked and I saw, and I thought about, what about my boss? Do I want his job? Do I want to work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week or whatever, and make more money and buy a car, a big house? And then what about his boss? Do I want to be his boss? And then I said, no, I want to have leisure time. I want to retire when I'm young so that I can do those things, so that I'm physically and mentally able to do the things I want to do. I'll worry about my old age when I get there.
Is there anything in the surfing mentality that you've connected to your trading or that you see philosophically, the act of surfing?
There's a whole sociology behind surfing, and especially when I got into it, it was sort of an outlaw mentality, and the idea of being free and being able to travel and being able to follow the surf. The surf is a very, so we say, jealous companion, because when it comes up, you got to be there. In other words, it's not like skiing or something where there's snow in the mountains and you go to the mountain and ski. It's like the surf comes up at what used to be unpredictable times, and you had to be available to go surfing when the surf was up. That was just a general characteristic of the sport. From the world I live in, the surfing world, the way I lived is a way that a lot of people lived. They weren't necessarily commodity traders. They were cab drivers or doctors, anybody who could manage their own lives to the point where they could do what they wanted more or less when they wanted to. And so after a while, that's just the world I lived in for most of my life. And of course, the other advantage of that is I've been able to think about a lot of different things in depth, not commodities or surfing. I've been able to give free rein to my imagination or my research in other fields. And there was also the broader movement of the counterculture and all this that had to do with dropping out or whatever. But I wasn't really dropping out. I was just adopting that attitude towards living that focused more on the moment than on planning for the future or accumulating wealth or whatever.
One just curiosity surfing question. Was there ever, maybe all, maybe none, did any of your surfing companions ever come up to speed or get an inkling of the career that you were living?
Oh, yeah. Nobody really knows what it's like to be a trader except for a trader. On the other hand, they knew what I did, that I made my money by trading the markets and that it didn't take me a lot of time. And I ran a computer program and so on and so forth. And some of them are well educated and sophisticated enough to have a general idea of what I did. But people I surf with had different professions. But the idea was that they had all worked out a way, worked out their own lives such that they could be free to be surfing, at least a lot of the time, to be available when the surf came up. From my view, I'm not a particularly unique person. I had a particular way of making myself available to the surf, and other people had their own ways. And it was sort of the beginning. And in those days, there weren't a lot of people that did that. You pretty much went through all the steps to your career and all that. And I just stepped off the bus, I guess.
Did you always have the even keel that I see right now, even when you were, let's say, 21, or were you always pragmatic and thoughtful about how you looked at things, very even keeled?
I wouldn't call myself even keeled. I was pretty crazy.
Okay, give me a couple crazies before I get into more trend following.
Well, I don't know if I want to go there. But...
Okay, let's go back to trend following. Back in the day, here's what Donchian's doing. You look at Edwards and McGee, and you probably got it, I don't know, you'll tell me, but maybe some inclination about where some other people were going at that point in time. And I guess you could have gone the Donchian direction, and you could have, as you described, a fairly simple approach. Your approach, I checked out your interview with Niels at Top Traders, and Niels is a good guy. But your approach is a touch more complicated than a typical trend following price action system. It seems like you're getting to the same place, but you're getting there in your own unique way.
Yeah, I guess I was taken by the geometrical aspect of traditional technical analysis. My original idea was to take what was valuable in that technical analysis and turn it into a system so that it was not based on judgment. In other words, if you're drawing trend lines and things like that, if you're doing that from a discretionary basis, there's a lot of different possibilities there. And of course, that changes. Then you're in a position of using your judgment to determine where you would put the trend lines. And of course, that leads to the kind of inconsistency that I'm trying to avoid. All I did was take what seemed to be fairly straightforward rules and turn it into essentially a system, a computer program.
Do you think that Edwards and McGee, I'm assuming the answer would be no, they put that work together without the systematic computer approach that you did?
I put my original system together largely without computers because I was one of the first people to have a PC back in 1976, early 1976. Most of my system development and system testing and all that was done manually with CRB chart books and that sort of thing. But I had a computer mentality, shall we say. You don't have to have a computer to run a system. You have to think like a computer. In other words, do the same thing over and over. Computerizing the strategy was just a matter of taking that logic, those procedures, and programming them into code.
Why don't you go ahead, because as I mentioned a second ago, your approach, the fractal wave algorithm, as you describe it, is quite a different approach than if somebody was to explain a breakout price action trading system. It's getting to a similar ending. It's taking what the market gives you. It's trying to get the meat of the trend. How would you describe the fractal wave algorithm to the novice or the experienced? Because I don't think most people are familiar with it.
Well, once again, it's based upon the premises of fractal geometry, where you have nested patterns. You have a pattern within a pattern within a pattern. The most basic pattern is just a zigzag pattern. Price goes up, down, and then up. And so you can use that as the kernel or as the basis for developing a system that incorporates higher and higher levels of detail, or I should say, when it comes down to it, the performance of the system is really based upon the underlying theory of these distributions that have fat tails. Although it was attractive to design this around the fractal wave algorithm, that's obviously not a necessary.
Worked for you. You figured it out.
Yeah, it worked for me. What we were doing at the time, we were looking at, when I say we, I was working with a friend of mine, Art von Wahlberg. He's the one who actually came up with the logic behind the fractal wave algorithm. But what we were trying to do was to automate the Elliott wave, which was popular at the time. And we found out that that was impossible because the Elliott wave was overdetermined and because it relies too much on discretion, determining where the waves are and so on and so forth. And what came out of that was a simpler algorithm, which is the fractal wave algorithm, which it's probably more like the Dow theory, which you have a series of higher highs and higher lows and a series of lower highs, and then those make a larger pattern of higher highs and higher lows, which make a larger pattern of higher highs and lower lows. So the fractal wave algorithm was essentially the automation of the Dow theory. That provided a substrate then for determining where you would put your entry orders and your stop loss orders and so on and so forth. The fractal wave algorithm provided a structure, but it wasn't in itself a system. It was just a structure that gave you various options as to where to actually place your trades.
Your time frame, weekly bars?
Yeah. My first system was daily. After a few years, I don't know if it was the markets or what, but it became less effective. When I got into exploring the fractal wave algorithm and all that, my first idea was to trade short-term system in the direction of a long-term system, direction of a long-term indicator. What I discovered was that I might as well just trade the long-term indicator. In other words, instead of taking pieces out of a trend, I'd try to get as much of the trend as possible. Now, obviously, that exposes you to a bit more risk, but the risk is mitigated by just trading a number of markets. So I trade about 40 different markets. It was easier to manage. It was something that lazy, and it was easier to trade off the weekly charts. And second, it seemed to be more in tune with the actual market fundamentals, because after all, whatever we do in commodities is really based upon the cash markets. I think of myself as being a fundamental trader who trades the fundamentals technically. In other words, I believe in the fundamentals, but I don't trade directly based on those. I trade on the idea that when the price of copper goes up, people start digging new mines and so forth, and then you get oversupply and then so on and so forth. So you have these cycles that have to do with particular commodities. They're sort of business cycle timeframes, 4 years or something like that. If you're trading out to a certain extent, if you're trading longer term, you're more in tune with those longer term cycles. That's essentially where I ended up. It was partly a matter of convenience, but just partly a matter of it seemed to match the market better and avoid a lot of the noise.
There's no doubt that what you've just said should resonate with people that I'm about to describe, but I see so much communication, so many people that will say, I'll ask them about their strategy and their time frame, because often they'll say, oh, I'm a trend following trader. And I've learned to say, they might be defining it differently than maybe I am. And I'll say, well, what's your time frame? Do you know what the favorite time frame that I hear in the last couple of years is? They'll tell me they're a trend following trader. They tell me their time frame is 5 minutes.
They're living in a different universe. I have a good friend who's a high frequency trader. It has nothing to do with what I do. They're in a different business. I know what they do or know enough about what they do to realize that the dynamics, the theory, the behavior of the markets, all of that is much different than in the long term.
I would think that if people, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, that if people want to be inspired by you and look to the high frequency traders. I met a gentleman over in Singapore a couple of years ago, showed me his shop, his high frequency shop. It sure seems like if people want to take a stab at trading and go down a path, that trying to emulate your path makes a lot more sense than to try to emulate the high frequency path.
Yeah, but if you look at the people that have been around for a long time, they've all gravitated towards the longer term trading, or I should say most of them have. Part of it is that high frequency trading is really a hard game. There aren't that many people who actually are successful at it. When that started out, according to my friend who's been in it since the beginning, when it started out, it was pretty easy because nobody else was doing it. It was the same as when I started out as a systems trader. You really had an advantage over the average trader because you just had the technology that wasn't being widely applied. Apparently, the high-frequency trading business is a really tough business these days. And most of the people, I think, who are doing it are like market makers than they are traders. My opinion is, if I were thinking about getting into the business these days, high-frequency trading would be the last place I'd look.
There must be something that when people first come into this world, there must be some, I don't know if it's information flow or social media or gut feel why people think that this short-term stuff would somehow or another be the direction to go in. I'm like you. I think 5 minutes and I'm like, what am I doing? I'm going to be like glued to the screen. I'm going to be stressed. It's nothing I'd want to do.
That's a good point. For instance, one of the things that were popular when I was in my formative years was Beat the Dealer.
Ed Thorpe's book.
Yeah. I thought about that because that was obviously a trading system and so forth. And I thought, what do I want to do? Do I want to sit in a smoky casino all day and all night doing this stuff? No. Really, what I just naturally gravitated towards were methodologies that required the least amount of work for the most amount of gain. And the thing is, if you're trading short term, of course, this is different now, but when I was thinking about these things, the commission rates were just unbelievable, were sky high, $100 a round turn type of thing. The slippage costs, the costs you were paying for slippage were really high. So there were a lot of structural things in the markets that mitigated towards you trading a longer term. It was just too costly to trade short term. Nowadays, it's paying for order flow and all that, so it's a bit different. But nevertheless, you're still really having to deal with the noise. And it's just difficult to do. It requires a lot of attention, lots of computer power, and you got to be next to the exchange and all that sort of thing. It's another world. It's literally another world from the world I live in.
Let me keep you at some of this personal psychology makeup for a moment. I've seen you talk about this, the avoiding of groupthink, that you have not really been. You've already talked about the surfing and very different lifestyle, but you have not been the guy that wanted to be in New York City or Chicago with all of the, quote, players going down that particular direction. Obviously, you figured out a way to do it your way, and it's worked really well. Why did you instinctively know that you wanted to avoid the groupthink, that you didn't want to hear from whatever broker all the time or whatever other trader, and you knew you didn't want to be immersed in that?
It was well known then that 95% or some related percentage of traders lost money. The idea that if you're doing what the 95% is doing, you're obviously not going to be successful. So one of the things, it was important to try to insulate yourself from that so that you weren't sucked into that logic. When you read the news in the paper, the commodity news or whatever, it's always out of date, shall we say, and our frequency. And to put it another way, it's just not informative at all. To avoid that influence, it makes sense just to stay away from it. Plus, it was the same sort of thing. I didn't want to be a floor trader where I'm coming in every day and yelling and screaming at everybody. I wanted to live a more relaxed lifestyle.
Were you the first CTA, one of the first CTAs?
I was one of the first. There was a group that centered around Commodity Corp in the East Coast that was sort of independent, really followed Donchian's lead, I think. We had a group in San Francisco that was more loosely, we didn't really communicate that much, but there were a handful of us who were getting into the business. So I was in the business before it was regulated by the CFTC, before there was a CFTC. I can't say I was the first, I was in the first group, but most of the people, at least the people that I was aware of, really came across this independently. Say, oh, I heard from this guy that's doing this and so on and so forth. I was in the founding group who I think by and large, at least on the West Coast, just made independent discoveries following probably somewhat similar. There were a lot of people who were in the aerospace industry who had mathematical backgrounds and so on and so forth. that appealed to them. It's hard to say. It was in the air. Hard to say who was first.
But you're right there. I guess I should have asked this at the beginning, but when you first, and I'm going to go back in time before this in a second, but when you first really wrapped your arms around the idea of trend following, you had your first system, you knew that, wow, okay, I've got a chance to do what I want for my whole life, lifestyle-wise. What was that feeling? I mean, it must have been a nice feeling to go, because look, if you make enough money doing this pretty quick, you can do the math better than anybody. You could immediately spreadsheet your life out and go, I got enough money to do what I want to do for the rest of my life.
And in fact, that wasn't really an important thing to me. The most important thing for me was to be able to support myself without working too hard, and to provide the time for me to live the life that I wanted to live, which was a surfing life and a life of intellectual freedom. And so I really wasn't focused on the money because, I don't know, I just didn't care about it that much. It's probably still the case. I was more interested in maximizing my leisure than I was maximizing my income.
I love your story. Let me take you back even to further a foundational thought, and I'll set it up this way. I had someone on this show a while back. I think she's at Berkeley, actually, a psychologist. Her name's Alison Gopnik. She's written about something called Bayesian babies. The idea that babies, when they learn, they see one thing and they follow it and they follow it. And if it keeps going good and it keeps feeling good, they just keep going that direction. I know your early background, a kind of a Bayesian decision theory thinking. Why don't you contrast that? Because I did not learn this formally in school, but when one starts to understand this Bayesian thinking, it makes so much perfect sense.
The Bayesian decision theory that I took was a technical and sophisticated methodology that really has not found wide application, at least not in business. But you're right, it's more of a way of just looking at the world, looking at probability theory. So I think that's been a thread that's been with me throughout my life, as I was convinced early on that probability was epistemological, not ontological. And that's influenced my view of probability. But once again, it's not really related to trading or what I'm thinking about in terms of trading. It's a parallel interest that I've had, I suppose.
In your trading, were you always of the mindset that the system that you had, the approach you had, the fractal wave algorithm, always from the beginning that this would be applied uniformly across markets?
Yeah, my original system was not fractal wave, but by the same token, it involved the trend lines and the support and resistance, the basic Edwards and McGee patterns. I think the idea of it being universal came from the fractal wave algorithm, because that was something that it was a way of decomposing data, and that applied to any data stream. I've applied it to other markets in India and Japan and things like that. Not that I've traded those markets, but I've just tested it. And yeah, it pretty much works on everything. Obviously, it works better on some things than others, just because the markets have different histories. But if you were to give me a market and say, would you trade this without testing or anything? I'd say, yeah, apply the same system and off we go. I'd have confidence that it would work the way it has for other markets.
When you're having a good year, no steep drawdown, and you're making a lot of money like 2008 versus another year where you're losing a lot of money perhaps, speak to the emotions you're feeling given those different states of the success of your system or the lack of success. I used the phrase earlier, even keeled. Didn't like that one necessarily, but do you feel the same during these periods, or is there something different internally?
It's hard to totally insulate yourself from it. In some extent, I feel more comfortable in down markets than I do in up markets when I'm making money.
Just to clarify, you feel better when you're losing money than making money?
Yeah, I have an idea of where that's going to go and how that's going to end. Whereas when I'm making money, the sky's the limit. If you're going to make a little bit of money or a lot of money or whatever, it's much more variable. I should say maybe the uncertainty is greater when you're making money than it is when you're losing money. So in the sense that you're emotionally reacting to uncertainty, then it's sometimes a bit more comfortable just When you're losing money, it's because you're being whipsawed, you're being ground by trades that are getting in and out and in and out. And it's not very exciting. And the thing that it tries your patience, because most of the time the markets are in drawdown. Only a relatively small fraction of the time are they making these runs where you're making a lot of money.
If I'm thinking about your other peers, and you've come at this from what I've seen, and I've talked to a lot of your peers, many of the ones that have been around since you started, but you come at this so different, even though you've come at this in a very different way. When you look at the correlation of performance, other CTAs compared to you over time, have you been pretty tightly correlated?
Yeah, I'd have to say that my performance could be used as an index of CTA performance. And of course, it's trend following performance. We don't make money because we're smart. We make money because the markets give us those opportunities. Anyone who has the discipline to follow a system, and of course, not all systems are going to work. There's something that I have never quite figured out what makes a system better or worse than another system. But I think certainly the people who have been around for a long time have homed in on the same time frame and the same basic strategies. So it's a Darwinian process. Weeded out the people. For instance, most money that's in managed futures is in trend following systems. And that's just because the other methodologies haven't survived in competition. So you have to wonder if most of the money's with people who, shall we say, are following trend following systems and all that, who are they taking the money from? And once again, that comes down to fundamentals. That is, there are people, we're basically selling insurance to people who are producers or consumers and need the product and are willing to lock in profits or whatever. And so it's come down to pretty much of a classical arbitrage game or classical. We're willing to take on risk and take on that risk and take it off the shoulders of the people who don't want to carry it. It's all pretty simple after all these years. It's gone through a long evolutionary process, and I think it's pretty much stabilized out.
When I first started digging through, so to speak, and investigating everything I could find on trend following, sometime in the 1990s, but of course that quickly led me going back to your early career and that whole time frame and finding everything I could there too. One of the most interesting things I used to see, though, when I first started getting into this, I couldn't really wrap my arms around it, is it sure seemed like to me that the best traders in the trend following space were 100% systematic. But when I used to go through all those disclosure documents that I would pull from the CFTC, you'd read through the style, and there was always this, we're 95% systematic, but 5% discretion. And I could never figure this out. All these trend following traders were saying they were 5% or 10% discretion. And I was thinking, even before I really wrapped my arms around everything, it's like, I don't believe this. This is marketing to appeal to somebody. Because if you're a systematic trend following trader, you're going to believe in the system. But then all of these traders are saying they've got 5% discretion. And here you are, you're very blunt about it. And I'm curious if you've always been 100% systematic.
The people I know, and I know some of the same people you mentioned, they're 100% systematic. That might be a marketing ploy or whatever, but the number one realization is the need to be systematic and to stick with your system and to do what it tells you to do.
If I stay at this idea of a system for a little bit longer, did you play with discretion ever early on, or was it always that your early training, your early research, your early investigation, it was like, nope, it's 100%, this is it? There was never a side of you where it was like, you know, I'm a pretty smart guy. I've done a lot of interesting schooling. There's got to be some of that can add some extra value to my system.
No, I don't know that I ever was interested in. I saw very clearly the idea that 95% of traders lose money and so on and so forth. That was pretty obvious to me that discretionary traders lost money. I had no confidence in my own abilities. I may have tested them out a little bit, but hardly to any extent. I had very low confidence that I had the psychological makeup or just the information to succeed as a discretionary trader.
The Warren Buffett path did not intrigue you.
Yeah, but Warren Buffett does what I do, really. I mean, he's very consistent. He sticks with his trades for years, all that. When you actually dissect what Warren Buffett does, He's a long-term trend follower. The discretionary trader, one thing that characterizes a so-called discretionary trader is that he's got to have the action. He's got to be in the markets. It's a psychological need that he's satisfying. It's not irrational. A system trader is one way of being a long-term trader. And a long-term trader, and this is true in the markets, obviously the best way to trade the markets is put your money in an index fund and let it ride.
Is there something very early in your life, as a teenager perhaps, is there something very early in your life that you can recall that helped you lay the foundation for all the choices that you made?
No. Not that I can think of.
The thing is, you have to realize the way that you approach talking about this, you're just very matter of fact. And I love it. We've talked about some of the earlier stages, but beyond going to school, getting those early jobs and being exposed to the computers at the Air Force stuff and whatnot, was there anybody along the way, or was it just kind of you and your self-taught? Was there anybody along the way that was really influential in the development of your trading?
People that were influential, the people I worked with at this think tank, they had a very unique way of approaching modeling. We were at the cutting edge of modeling.
Put the year on that, Bill, just for context, what year we would have been talking roughly.
This would be the late 60s, shall we say, the late 60s and early 70s. And this was the height of the Cold War, and there was a lot of money going into these new modeling technologies that had been developed by von Neumann and people like that. This was the first stage of applying these technologies. We were doing a lot of really original work. A lot of it was top secret and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, there were a series of models that developed. There's sort of not an infinite number of models out there. There's a limited number of approaches to modeling various phenomena. Most of those models came into being in that era. I read a book not too long ago, The Physics of Wall Street. And the idea was to talk about the various physics models and mathematical models that were being applied. I read through this book. Every one of these models were models that we knew about back in the 60s. And many of them had been resurrected. Things like deep learning, right? Well, this is like neural nets. It's just a continuation of a model that's been around for decades. And this is true with other models. So what's happened at this point is that these models have become careers. And so people specialize in the various types of modeling. But we were much more ecumenical than that. We applied the model, we selected the model to fit the task, not selected the task to fit the model. We call that model shopping. And that's what people do nowadays. They're educated to apply certain kinds of models, and then they take that model and they say, okay, I'm going to apply this to whatever, to commodity trading or whatever, as opposed to saying, what's the appropriate model for this problem? There's a lot of things that I see in terms of modeling and all that haven't changed in years. We're going into probably the second AI winter now. AI hype back in the 80s, when everybody thought machines are taking over and so on and so forth. And now we're hyping AI again. No different than it was. I mean, it's different because you've got the computing power has blown up so much, but data is not thought. Data mining is not thought. And it's thinking, and it's the concept. It's the kind of creativity. Human beings have a creativity that computers are incapable of. And that's going to be true for the foreseeable future. I tend to look at a lot of this high-tech modeling and all that. I mean, if you want to see what AI does, it's like go online and you get all these ads popping up for something you've already bought. I mean, is that intelligence?
One of my favorite guests on this show, maybe you know of him or met him, I don't know, but a gentleman named Robert Aumann, and he won the Nobel Prize in game theory. I was a little petrified to talk to this 90-year-old Israeli game theorist. What was so great about him was the way he explained things and just explaining mutually assured destruction. He's like, look, we had to have the bombers up there ready to go for 40 years straight. That's what kept the peace. One of those light bulb moments where you're just like, wow, he took all the math that he has in his head that the average person can't understand, you probably can, and he just simplified it in a way where you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Well, that's right. And we were doing very sophisticated modeling, but by the same token, we understood that in an actual nuclear exchange or whatever, most of that stuff wouldn't work. I mean, it would just be chaos. You had to sort of keep up with that game because the other side was keeping up with the game. And then you got to the point you didn't know who was on first. That was essentially my understanding also, is that you were in a situation where you had to do it in what looked like something that was counterproductive, say to the public, was actually necessary in terms of the situation at the time.
One of the favorite topics in your industry, in the trend following industry, one of the favorite topics of the media about every 5 years, trend following is dead. It's gone. It's over. They're all losing money. It's never going to work again. And then something happens. And this is a pretty repeatable pattern. You've been at this for decades. So much wisdom, so much confidence. I'm not saying cockiness at all, but just a confidence that you see what the landscape looks like. If you have to look ahead of course, markets could change and all this and that. I mean, we've got Bitcoin coming online now and all this stuff. But people are people. Given all your decades of wisdom so far, how do you see a strategy of trend following unfolding for the next 50 years?
It'll change in terms of the particulars, I suppose.
You mean what markets are traded, perhaps?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's going to be new markets come into play and old markets are going to become inactive and that sort of thing. I think the basic trend following strategy relies on some pretty fundamental characteristics of human psychology and of economics. As long as there are markets, there will be trend following strategies. And I think the same underlying mechanisms that cause those to be viable will persist. My current system, I've been trading for over 30 years now. It's been virtually unchanged in that time. I've tweaked it a little bit here and there, but it's the point. It just keeps working. And the reason it works is not because the system itself, it's because of the environment that exists in the economic sphere. I mean, just can look at what's happening right now. Look at oil markets going up, a lot of volatility in various markets. Let me put it this way. When I look at the markets, the market behavior, I don't see anything that I didn't see 50 years ago. In fact, I've seen markets like sugar and cocoa and things like that just go bananas. I've seen cotton go up the limit 2 weeks in a row and then go down the limit 2 weeks in a row. Things that would be astonishing in today's markets were not so astonishing, as I say, back in the 70s. But by and large, the markets have behaved pretty much the same as they always have.
If you had to look ahead and you say, well, gosh, there's going to be trend following strategies, but there might be changes on the margins, would you also see something like the 40% winners, 60% losers, that type of philosophical foundation will still be a part of trend following too, because we don't have the ability to predict what's going to be the next big trend?
I think there's some general parameters like that a lot of people have discovered and that will continue to persist. That's just sort of the sweet spot in the markets, as it were. It's almost as if the markets are going to extract maximum pain traders. Any strategy that capitalizes on that pain is going to continue to make money. In other words, it's back to psychology that most people are wired to do the wrong thing when they're trading the markets. That's not going to change.
Are you ever going to retire?
I've retired. I've pretty much retired now.
But you're still trading?
Yeah, just for my own proprietary trading. But no, I'm not holding myself out. I've withdrawn my membership from the NFA and CFTC. So I'm not trading for clients. I'm just trading my own money.
But will you ever stop that?
Probably. I'm getting close to that. Because even what I'm doing requires that I stay engaged on a daily basis.
There must be a part of you that loves it, though, still.
Less and less, shall we say. I've got enough money. Just as soon put it in, like I say, in an index fund and forget about it.
Well, listen, I've taken you all kinds of territory. We've got more than enough to do a chapter here, and I can always fill in the blanks a little bit here and there with some great articles about you. So I appreciate you giving me some flavor. And I knew consciously I did not want to take you on a linear path. I wanted to just kind of touch on all kinds of stuff.
Well, I appreciate that. I was sort of apprehensive about having to go through and tell my story once again and so on and so forth.
I did good of not forcing you the same story.
I enjoyed this much more than I thought I would.
Oh, man, I'll take that. Well, listen, again, I've kept you. Thank you for coming on.
And thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.